Guten Abend. Ich freue mich sehr, dass Sie so zahlreich hier erschienen sind. Es ist sicher für die meisten oder für alle von uns die erste große Veranstaltung, die wieder möglich ist. Doch eine große Freude. Mein Name ist Sibyl Elam. Ich bin von der jüdischen Stimme für Demokratie und Gerechtigkeit in Israel und Palästina. Wir sind Host hier bei Kosmopolitics. Das ist Omri Boehm, Professor für Philosophie an der New York School for Social Research, zurzeit in Berlin. Er wird nachher gleich selber etwas zu seiner Herkunft sagen. Samir, Filmemacher, Kosmos-Mitbegründer, kennen Sie wohl alle. Samir hat auch schon einen langen Bezug zum Thema. Er ist ursprünglich aus Bagdad. Vermutlich haben auch die meisten von Ihnen den wunderbaren Film Iraqi Odyssey gesehen. Und er hat einen Film über die jüdischen irakischen Kommunisten gemacht, 2002, die nach Israel gekommen sind und es dort nicht ganz einfach hatten. Ich sollte eigentlich nur begrüßen, aber Shelley Berlowitz, die ihre Doktorarbeit zum Thema die Erfahrung der anderen, also zum Konflikt in Israel-Palästina zwischen Israelis und Palästinensern geschrieben hat, ist leider krank geworden. Und ich werde statt ihr mit Omri Boehm das Gespräch führen. Ich habe auch etwa 60 Jahre mich mit dem Thema auseinandergesetzt.
Ich nicht.
Ja. Gut, ich denke, willkommen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we should tell the people that we will speak tonight, let's say, bilingual. She started in German. We figured out, Omri is very eloquent and very elegant in German, but he prefers to speak in English. So we respect that. Mm-hmm. But be aware, he will understand every question. German.
Aber das heißt, alles kann auf Deutsch gefragt werden.
Okay.
Mindestens.
Okay. So me and Sibyl, we will speak the both language, if you don't mind. And I start with some really interesting stuff because of your background. I figured out that, in Wikipedia you are really recognized very seriously in a way, like he's an Israeli philosopher, associate professor at the New School, as she's told us. He's known for his interpretation of Binding of Isaac, Genesis 22, which is, I will tell you later, private of Genesis 22. My uncle, which is Islamic scholar, he is very much on that. He always tells me about it, so we will have something in common, it looks like. And then it goes on, works on Kant and writing on Israel and Zionism. His latest book, A Future for Israel Beyond the Two-State Solution, this will be the English title, as we know now.
The English title will be Haifa Republic.
Oh, I see.
We decided
so
to,
it's already wrong in
change
Wikipedia. But it says it develops a model for binational Zionism.
Right.
His writing has appeared in New York Times, Washington Post, Haaretz, and Die Zeit, among others. And now, interestingly, the German interpretation of your CV is very shorter, but it's also very clear, very German. Omri Boehm, geboren 1979 in Haifa, studierte in Tel Aviv und diente beim israelischen Geheimdienst Shin Bet.
I see.
Okay. Er ist israelischer und deutscher Staatsbürger. It looks like you cheated on us. Unter anderem hat er in München und Berlin geforscht und schreibt über israelische Politik in Haaretz, Die Zeit und den New York Times. Soweit similar. So, tell us more about your backstory.
You just told almost everything, excluding some of the mistakes that are written in Wikipedia that I noticed.
Okay.
But so everything that was mentioned is right. Not necessarily. It's accurate as a factual type of knowledge, I suppose. I was born in Israel. I was born in Haifa, but I actually dislike when people write that, because now people sometimes associate me with Haifa in a way that actually is inaccurate. Haifa for me is just a city, besides my interest in it for now familiar reasons. I grew up in the Galilee, and that's very much my home still. Haifa, of course, is near to the Galilee, and depending on your geography, it might belong to it or not, but it's not my city. I come from the real Galilee. So, you know, to the north of Haifa, and not a city, and that's actually growing up. It was always extremely important in my life. I moved to the U.S. after I finished my military service and my university at Tel Aviv. I moved to the U.S. to Yale University. I wrote a dissertation on Kant and Spinoza. The book on the Binding of Isaac is a book that I wrote when I was a soldier in the military. And I'm actually returning to that theme. We can talk about it, but this will take us far afield.
Okay.
I'm now incorporating some of what I've written in what I wrote in that early book into a new book that I'm trying now to finish. Yes, and Israel is a hobby turned profession, I suppose. Writing about this, trying to write about this as a concerned Israeli and as a philosopher also.
Huh.
So I do think that one thing that I try to do in the book is to write about Israel, among other things, as a philosopher. I think that the subject matter sometimes warrants that for all sorts of reasons.
I see. So for the Swiss guys, is of course they are very curious, but they are not keen to ask. So they would, of course, would like to know what's about the Shin Bet then.
I see. Look, I served. This is something that can be discussed, but one should not discuss it too much for obvious reasons. But also, it's not at the center stage. I mean, that service was a part of my service that I did as every other Israeli. It turns out that. Let me put it from the other side. Those are sensitive issues. I did my obligatory military service in the Israeli military, as I think probably if you're sitting here, then you probably know something about Israel. Then you would know that all Israeli men go for 3 years in the military as
and women?
Women go for 2.
Oh, I see.
And I did my service in there.
And you learned a lot of Arabic, since I know that
I wouldn't say that.
Shin Bet is also specialized. No.
I wouldn't. I wish I did. I did not learn a lot of Arabic. I could show off with you a few surprising phrases, but not more than that.
Okay. So at the moment you are living now in Berlin, and usually you live really in the States.
New York is where my wife, son, and I live. I mean, I'm a New Yorker, you could say, I suppose.
I see.
But we spend a lot of time also in Germany. Every year, for many, many years, we spend a lot of time in Germany and sometimes also stay. So I'd say 4 months a year we're in Germany. Sometimes we stay for a full year, if on sabbatical or research or something along those lines. So really a mix. That said, even though I am a German citizen, I did notice the Wikipedia page saying that I'm a German Israeli philosopher. I wouldn't call myself a German Israeli philosopher. I'm an Israeli philosopher. I also have the German passport and citizenship. It's
why is that?
Mittlerweile, it's part of also who I am, but I'm not German. So
okay. So you got the German passport because of your stay? Or?
Because of the berms.
Okay.
I got it, unlike many Israelis nowadays in Berlin, when I was very, very young. I got it when I was 4. So I grew up knowing that I also have a German citizenship, what was extremely uncommon.
Yeah.
In Israel of the time. Now, of course, it's a huge. Everybody wants a German or Polish, Romanian, less so Swiss because
they have
not belong to the Union. Last time I checked, there was a huge. It's actually interesting. There was an inhibition on this when I grew up in the 80s.
Mm. No, the Yekes were not really beloved.
The Yekes were not beloved, but the Germans were not beloved either. And even if they were tolerated, the idea of having a foreign citizenship in general, in an extremely patriotic, to be polite, let's call it patriotic. We can talk about the difference between patriotism and nationalism later. It's an important thing in the book. But in an extremely patriotic environment, it was frowned upon to have any other citizenship. Maybe American would be okay. It's true, though. I mean, those are contingent issues, and this is psychology, not. And most certainly, German citizenship was something that you could maybe even better in the 80s not tell your neighbors that you have it. In the meantime, it has completely changed, and everybody has it.
Good for you then. So, beside that, when I called you some weeks ago, you were already in Galilee. So you have their home base.
My parents are still in the Galilee. It's still, in many ways, my home.
And what is your Iranian relationship?
I'm half Iranian, so look, you're asking directly all the difficult questions. So I'll tell you what we say in Israel.
I know the Swiss are curious, but they don't like to ask. So I'm asking in behalf of them.
So I'll tell you the answer that I do not give in Germany, but I can give in Switzerland or in Israel. I'm 100% Aryan.
Oh,
half Iranian and half German. But I hope it's understood as well.
yes, I hope so.
Jewish joke. Half of my family came from Germany. My father's side of the family. They came from. My grandmother was from Breslau. My grandfather from Berlin, and my Iranian side, my mother's side of the family, came from Iran. My grandfather came from Hamadan in Iran, and my grandmother actually was born in Jerusalem, and also her grandparents were born in Jerusalem. This is uncommon for Israeli Jews. However, there were also Iranians.
Already then?
Yeah, there were, but a real Jerusalemite family.
So we should dig more. Maybe you have a Shiite neighbor.
Right.
So with me, we could share something. However, okay. So let's go from the past to the present. I think, Sibyl, you had a lot of questions.
Ja, weil ich habe viele Fragen, das ist klar. Sie werden ja auch später noch Fragen haben. Wir werden auch ein bisschen aus dem Buch vorlesen. Nicht allzu viel, erfahrungsgemäß.
Weil es hat ganz viele noch zum Kaufen danach und wer will alle unterscheiden.
Das Buch ist eigentlich ein radikales Umdenken weg von der Zwei-Staaten-Lösung, über die man immer gesprochen hat, hin zu einem binationalen Staat. Jetzt, das kennen wir von linksradikaler Seite, aber wir kennen es nicht von jemandem, der doch aus der Mitte der Gesellschaft kommt. Und ja, ich hoffe natürlich.
I wouldn't go that far. Call me.
Ich sage nicht, du bist nicht links, aber ich sage, es gilt immer noch als sehr radikal. Ja. Wenn man damit, ich denke in Deutschland stärker als in der Schweiz damit kommt, wird man schnell des Antisemitismus bezichtigt, weil sich ja die Frage stellt, ist das dann noch ein jüdischer Staat oder nicht? Und ich möchte jetzt etwas kurz vorlesen aus dem Buch, wo Omri Boehm argumentiert, weshalb die Zwei-Staaten-Lösung nicht mehr aktuell ist. Und anschließend mit dieser Frage der Republik Haifa werden wir nicht umhin kommen, auch über die gegenwärtige Situation zu sprechen, wo ja das Miteinander nicht gerade gut geklappt hat, to say the least. Also ich lese aus dem 4. Kapitel, Republik Haifa heißt es, das ist die Idee, die Omri Boehm hat, diese schöne Idee, diese nein, nicht Vision, diese Utopie. Ja, Vision muss man zum Psychiater, eine Utopie. Ja. Der Palästinenserpräsident Mahmoud Abbas machte im September 2015 Schlagzeilen, als er vor der UNO-Vollversammlung verkündete, dass sich die Palästinenser nicht länger an das Oslo-Abkommen gebunden fühlten. Schon vorher hatte Abbas gewarnt, er werde in seiner Rede eine Bombe platzen lassen. Doch angesichts der Tatsache, dass der Oslo-Prozess seit Jahren zur Fassade verkommen war, blieb unklar, welches Gewicht seine dramatische Ankündigung hatte. Die New York Times berichtete mit einer großen Schlagzeile über die Rede, tat Abbas Proklamation jedoch als einen sehr, sehr alten Hut ab. Auch die israelische Haaretz stellte nüchtern fest, Abbas habe zwar womöglich eine Bombe fallen lassen, geplatzt sei sie aber anscheinend nicht. Doch obwohl das Ende des Friedensprozesses 2015 nichts Neues war, kommt Abbas Erklärung rückblickend ganz erhebliche Bedeutung zu. Während seit langem alle gewusst hatten, dass Oslo tot war, schaute man lieber weg und war froh darüber, eine bequeme Illusion am Leben zu erhalten. So wurde Oslo zu Oslo, einem Codewort zur Wahrung des Status quo, wobei Wahrung des Status quo seinerseits ein Codewort für den unwiderruflichen Aufbau von Israels Besatzungsprojekt ist. In Zeiten der universellen Täuschung, soll George Orwell einmal festgestellt haben, wird das Aussprechen der Wahrheit zur revolutionären Tat. Dementsprechend hätte Abbas' performative Ankündigung eine kleine Revolution auslösen müssen. Dass kein radikaler Bewusstseinswandel eintrat, lag vor allem daran, dass nichts, was ein Palästinenserführer sagt oder nicht sagt, sehr viel zählt. Ironischerweise trug daher nichts so sehr zu einer ehrlichen Diskussion über die Oslo-Illusion bei, wie die Wahl Donald Trumps zum Präsidenten der Vereinigten Staaten. Er, der Bullshit-Künstler, das Buch ist natürlich erschienen vor einem Jahr, ja, als Trump noch Präsident war. Er, der Bullshit-Künstler, interessiert sich so wenig für die Wahrheit, dass er im Unterschied zu seriöseren Staatenlenkern auch einmal zu lügen vergisst. Auf einer Pressekonferenz, daran mögen sich sicher viele von Ihnen erinnern, auf einer Pressekonferenz kurz nach Amtsantritt zur Zwei-Staaten-Lösung befragt, antwortete Trump, der neben Netanyahu stand, er schaue sich das Zwei- und das Ein-Staaten-Modell an und möge das, was beide Seiten mögen. Leben könne er mit beiden. Im Grunde, sagte der amerikanische Präsident, was auch immer oder whatever, macht einfach irgendetwas, was auch immer. Und Netanyahu, der vermutlich überrascht, wenn auch angenehm darüber überrascht war oder so freie Hand zu kriegen, dass Amerikas jahrzehntealte Festlegung auf einen territorialen Kompromiss soeben kurzerhand ad acta gelegt worden war, gluckste überlaut im Hintergrund. Tatsächlich war Trumps was auch immer aufrichtiger und insofern von erheblichem Gewicht, als die über Jahre lakonisch wiederholten Mahnungen von Kerry, Obama, Clinton, Merkel und Co. Bald werde sich das Zeitfenster für die Zwei-Staaten-Lösung schließen. Oder das ist ja auch, wie man immer gesagt hat, dann ist es, wenn es einmal gleich viel sind, dann ist es Apartheid. Oder bald ist das Fenster vorbei. Es war gar nie offen oder lange schon nicht mehr offen. Als Trump im Mai 2018 die Verlegung der US-Botschaft nach Jerusalem ankündigte und anschließend Israels Annexion der Golanhöhen anerkannte, bewirkte das am unmittelbaren Ort des Geschehens keinen großen Unterschied. In den Köpfen sehr wohl. Der vorherrschenden Unehrlichkeit wurde ein schwerer Schlag versetzt. Mittlerweile sind Israels Annexionsprogramme im Westjordanland offiziell, mit Billigung beider Seiten des politischen Spektrums, also du meinst links und rechts, oder? Ja. Und sie werden mit Trumps Deal of the Century auch offiziell von der US-Regierung unterstützt. So gefährlich diese Entwicklungen sind, bergen sie doch auch eine Chance. Die Wahrheit zu sagen kann am Ende wichtig, wenn nicht geradezu revolutionär sein. Es wird keine Zwei-Staaten-Lösung geben und es ist an der Zeit für die erstrebenswerte Alternative eines einzigen gemeinsamen Staates zu kämpfen. Der eine Staat wird, nein, er ist schon Realität. Die Frage ist nur, was für eine Art Staat es werden wird. Und ich denke, da könnten wir jetzt an den aktuellen Ereignissen anschließen, als es, ich denke, zum ersten Mal seit vielen Jahren auch nicht nur die Beschießung von Gaza und von Gaza, nach Gaza und von Gaza, aber auch innerhalb Israels und natürlich auch in dem besetzten Westjordanland zu großen Ausschreitungen zwischen jüdischen und palästinensischen Menschen kam. Darf ich dir die Einschätzung der jetzigen Situation ist das Illusion, ist nichts zu machen, wird es nicht gehen?
The two-state solution, I think, as those, I think that in some moments in the book, this is one of them, I try to explain why I do not think that there will be a two-state solution. In fact, when I think about it, as a philosopher call it, here I'm not arguing why there will not be a two-state solution. I just pronounce it, assume it, and claim that that it's been alive for a long time. I do try to also argue in the book why there would not be a two-state solution, and that I do, in fact, in the German edition there is a preface and a foreword and everything, but in the first moment where the book begins, I actually try to argue why there would not be a two-state solution, why it's a lie. And there are two reasons, sorry, there are two reasons that I can mention fast. And it's important to do this because the reasons are slightly different, I think, than the ones commonly considered. Usually when people speak about the demise of the two-state solution, they say that there are too many settlers in the West Bank. That's of course important, but I think it's not actually the main or philosophically the sufficient reason for the death of the two-state solution. And normally we do not even consider the main reason why there cannot be a two-state solution. And I will be bold enough to say, even though that's not a language that I usually use, we don't consider it because we're colonialists. I'm not a post-colonial thinker. I'm, in fact, often very critical of post-colonialism as a discipline, as a Kantian of sorts. But there is a certain colonialist Haltung. The main reason for the impossibility of a two-state solution is the number of the Palestinians. And it is the assumption that the Palestinians matter very little and that they are supposed to accept whatever compromise they receive that makes it extremely comfortable to just ignore them and to make all sorts of questions, ask deep questions about the number of settlers and their location. In the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea currently lives, people forget that, a Palestinian majority. Even the most quote-unquote generous two-state offers give to this majority about 22% of the land. To say nothing about the fact that this is divided, so some of this is in Gaza, some of this is in the West Bank. And I have not mentioned in a word yet the number of settlers in this tiny piece of 22%, right? So I haven't even mentioned that. Now the Palestinians are obviously incapable of accepting this as a compromise. And when they don't, then they're being called anti-Semitic, who just want to destroy Israel, und so weiter und so fort. The truth is that it's impossible to build a state, a sovereign state, for 53 approximately percent of the population on this tiny 22% of the land. And I haven't said a word yet on the 700,000 settlers who live in the West Bank, on maybe evacuating them. Let's say you only have to evacuate 350,000 if you have border adjustments. Some of those settlements obviously will not be evacuated. Ariel, for example, 20,000 settlers is deep in the territory. For those of you who remember the Abzug from Gaza, 8,400 settlers were evacuated from Gaza. So the numbers are insanely different. For that reason, I think that in a way we almost do not need to discuss so much the two-state solution. It's a waste of time. There will not be a two-state solution. One word that I can add about this, because this often comes up in discussions like this, maybe especially the Swiss are famous for their compromises. It's a compromising nation, and I'm not against compromise. The Israeli philosopher Avishai Margalit, an important philosopher, I'm often critical of Avishai Margalit. In fact, I'm critical of Avishai Margalit for other reasons in the book, harshly critical. He coined an important distinction in philosophy between what he calls a compromise and a rotten compromise. Because we want to say that compromises are important and good, but we also want to say that not all compromises have to be accepted. So how do you cut philosophically the distinction? And philosophically, the answer is roughly the following. A good compromise is not supposed to achieve justice. Justice is for radicals. You go and kill people for justice. A good compromise is supposed to achieve peace. And a rotten compromise is one that actually is not supposed to even achieve that. We can discuss this. This is where things become sensitive and problematic. For example, we can ask a question. Is the 1947 UN partition resolution, was it a compromise or a rotten compromise? We can discuss. And I think it will be a surprising, interesting discussion, because that often comes up when people speak about how the Jews accepted the compromise and the Palestinians rejected it, which brought, say, the Nakba, or brought on the Palestinians their own tragedy, and so weiter and so forth. That's an example of how to apply this discussion, this standard to the discussion. Applied to the two-state solution, it seems, I think, obvious that the two-state solution cannot be an accepted compromise. It offers the Palestinians right now a rotten compromise, not a compromise, that they cannot accept. Again, before I said a word about the settlers, here's another way to formulate this, and then maybe I can say another word about, you mentioned the current situation. I actually went sideways a bit with the two-state solution. Look, some people on the left in Israel who accepted the Trump deal of the century said, what do you want? This is a two-state offer. My thinking is, actually they are right. Not because a two-state solution ever offered the Palestinians a two-state solution. The difference between the two-state solution as we know it today is not so different from Trump's deal of the century. There is some kind of an hypocrisy according to which the two-state solution is the only hope of good liberals, and the Trump deal of the century is a disaster. The truth is, the Trump deal of the century is a disaster. It's very similar in many ways in its structure to the familiar Oslo two-state solution. The differences, I would say, are quantitative, not qualitative. If I had to defend that proposition, I would. So that's a good way of saying, because I think almost no, let's say, moderate, reasonable person would deny that the Trump deal was a rotten compromise and not a compromise that was supposed to bring peace. So one way to see the problematics with the two-state solution is to see the similarity between the two-state solution as we learn to support it and the Trump deal of the century. As to the current situation in Israel, there are many things to say about this, of course, but I think that one of the most obvious things that we could see is the one-state reality. That was the clearest in the political position of Palestinian Israelis, who understand themselves as one people with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and who considered the hostilities or the campaign or the event as their business in the first order, something that often Israelis like to repress. We think of, there are Arab Israelis, and then Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. They are the Palestinians. If they ask for, say, national self-determination or national sovereignty, that's fine, because those are the Palestinians, and if we're good liberal Zionists, then we can endorse it. And the Arab Israelis are just Israeli citizens, and they're not part of these people somehow. I'm sure that if you ask the good liberal Zionists, then they would know that they are part of these people, but the problem is sort of repressed. I think that the one-state reality was the clearest in the situation within Israel, which reflected the fact that the Palestinian people is united, and that the fate of the Palestinian people is one between the Jordan River and the sea. For example, speaking today, this is all the more today, something that interests people because of the new government coalition that may or may not form in the next days. So people speak about the incorporation of Palestinian Israelis not just into Israeli society, but into Israeli politics, because the new coalition, if it will be formed, requires the support of Palestinian Israelis. There's a little problem with this, and it is that the more Palestinians will become part of the Israeli politics, they will become the occupiers and the perpetrators, in a way, of the Palestinian people. The realization that, for that reason, those trends only have their limit is extremely important, because, again, the reality is one in which the land is united. The people are united. So the solutions also cannot depend logically and politically. I belong to those who think that logic matters in politics. Not always, but often logic matters, if not immediately, then with time. So those contradictions will not be resolved without a one-state style solution.
Glaubst du, dass diese Spannungen noch zunehmen werden, diese ethnischen Spannungen, die wir jetzt, weil der Status quo ist ja für Israel akzeptabel, die meisten, man hat das jetzt wieder bei den Wahlen gesehen, die Besatzung ist gar kein Thema, ein Staat, zwei Staat, eigentlich interessiert es niemand. Es wird erst interessieren, wenn die Spannungen wirklich zunehmen. Hast du den Eindruck, dass das passieren könnte?
Absolutely. This is one of the things that, I don't know if proud is the right word, this is one of the things that I wrote in the book. The claim was there is either going to be a different alternative to the dead language of the two-state solution, or the debates about apartheid are one step behind in the chess game. We're looking at ethnic violence, or at least the potential for ethnic violence, that's much more serious than just apartheid. We need to understand history. There was a reason why the Nakba happened. There was a reason why a Jewish state could not exist without expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine. This is a history that's been repressed, not studied, and it threatens to repeat itself. Sometimes people say, a Jewish democracy cannot exist with an Arab majority. And this is, of course, true. But it's too weak. It doesn't state the whole truth. The truth is not just that a Jewish and democratic state cannot be with an Arab majority. A Jewish state cannot exist with an Arab majority. In the long run, this Arab majority will resist. And once it resists, the Jewish state will have to defend itself from more than 50% of its de facto population. Right now, there is an Arab majority between the Jordan and the sea. The way in which Israel controls this majority is complex. We can discuss that. It's not uniform on the whole territory. But it still de facto controls one way or another this whole population. I don't know if this is controversial, but in the last years, this majority has been relatively peaceful. This is not to say that Hamas is peaceful. This is not to say that shooting rockets on civilians is not a war crime. It's a war crime. That can be discussed and debated and needs to be said clearly. But we haven't seen suicide bombs in Tel Aviv. We haven't seen missiles from Ramallah on Ben Gurion airports. Things can become much worse. We haven't seen street fights between Arabs, Palestinian, Israelis and Jews in mixed cities in Israel. When the Palestinian people will actually resist that situation, we can see situations that are much, much worse than the familiar occupation or apartheid situation. And I think that we got a warning. The genie went back into the bottle for now. It would be extremely unwise not to have noticed this genie and to respond to it. Yes, I think things can become worse, unfortunately.
Okay, so till now we have not spoken about the current situation, but maybe it's not the time to talk about that. Maybe we leave it up later to the people to ask you here about that question. I would love to proceed about your book, because this is I have note a lot which I believe I cannot read to you now because we are already out of time. But maybe I can resume some chapters. One of the most important part to me is as an Arab, that you are writing about the Nakba, and you're writing that as an Israeli. So it means that there is a recognition, and you are also talking in your book about it has to be recognized. And without that, it would not be possible to continue in any case, in any, there is no solution than to accept that. And I was really surprised how many details I got from you, which in all these details I didn't know so far. Like the planned Dalit of the Haganah, how they wanted to expulse people. Okay, all the ethnic cleansing I have read already in other books from historians, Israeli historians. All the details, how some villages were really erased in a very, very terroristic way and awful. The other thing which surprised me, beside that chapter, that was the chapter about, in a way, like telling us the Holocaust in a way as an idea to reconstitute Israel as ethnicity should be forgotten, or let's say it should be put in oblivion. That was something which I also was surprised. The two surprises in your books, beside things which I have not read till now. I didn't know that Hannah Arendt went to this American Zionist reunion in Atlanta, and where she was shocked that there was the discussion, or not, it was not even a discussion, it was a decision to say that the whole land should be Jewish, period. So also the Begin plan, I didn't know anything about that he had the idea, of course, to annex everything, but he had also a very clever and smart idea to include the Palestinian in his plan. Begin was to me, just the bad guy, nothing else. So I was really surprised that you went so deeply into history, which I have not read till yet now by historians. So that was a lot of flowers to you, but maybe you tell us about these two theses you had about, the oblivion on the Holocaust and the recognition of the Nakba.
Yeah. At some point, I think I didn't write this line, and I'm not sure if I should be happy or sad that I didn't write it in the book in the end. I said, I hope in the book to save history a little bit from the historians. I think that what I did in the end is I wrote in the acknowledgements, I said, look, the book has profited so much from the writings of this and that historians, Tom Segev, Dmitry Shumsky, Benny Morris, Seth and Siska, and so weiter and so forth. But I just try to draw on their state-of-the-art history in order to provide some kind of philosophical imagination of actual politics rather than a description of the past. So I say this by means of the methodology that the book assumes. I'm not an historian, and I don't claim to have discovered, in terms of historical discoveries, anything in the book. I just rely on history, familiar history, and by familiar you might mean not necessarily familiar to the reading public, but definitely then for experts.
Okay, but come to.
But then bring them out of the grave. Now the book has two statements that seem to be contradictory. One is we have to forget the Holocaust in a certain sense. The other is we have to remember the Nakba. Of course, I do not mean any of them in a straightforward, simple sense, and they're not contradictory at all. The claim about forgetting the Holocaust is the following. In 1988, an Israeli philosopher called Yehuda Elkanah, an Auschwitz Überlebender, he survived Auschwitz when he was 10. He wrote an important short op-ed in Haaretz called In Praise of Forgetfulness. And he said, the most significant, the most serious danger to Israel's existence is currently the memory of the Holocaust. So we have to forget the Holocaust. And the reason why the Holocaust's memory, according to Yehuda Elkanah, a very important philosopher in Israel, was also in Zurich for some time, Sibylle reminded me, is that the Holocaust as an argument undermines rational politics. It undermines the notion of citizenship as a basis of sane, that is, rational democratic politics, liberal politics. He didn't say more than that. He left it at that, as far as I know, and I think that I do know. So what I try to do in this chapter is to try to have a reconstruction of what it would mean, because I have no doubt that one term that you used I would correct, and Elkanah would have corrected it as well. The Holocaust by no means should be abandoned to oblivion. We absolutely have to know that it existed. So what does he mean by saying that we need to forget it? And I try to reconstruct with Ernst Renan a certain notion of remembering to forget. That is, we have to remember that the Holocaust happened in order to be able to put it aside. Where the practices of remembering are ensured, people can also move on from their memories, from those memories, as types of commands that prevent rational politics. So the Holocaust can be put in that way. Aside. What I try to show is that the Holocaust has become in Israel a threat on the notion of citizenship, because the memory of the Holocaust is the unifying, the main unifying principle of everybody together, and not citizenship. Now, with everybody, of course, we mean everybody is a Jews, not Arabs, not Palestinians.
That was was a surprise when you said everybody, because in your book you say it means Jews. But you have a good example presented in your book about, the story of Ahmed Tibi, the leader of the Arab Party in the Knesset, in the parliament, which this was an incredible story you explained in your book.
So the trick is, the trick as I try to suggest it in the chapter, is to say when we speak about forgetting the Holocaust, what we need, the way to think about it is to denationalize the memory of the Holocaust and to make it public. It has to be a public duty of citizens as such to remember the Holocaust. And there is actually, despite, I don't know if it seems like commonsensical to you or not, despite what is obviously Israeli common sense, there is no reason why Arabs and Jews in Israel, as a civic duty, should not commemorate the Holocaust together. I can, as a private citizen in a state, forget the Jewish state for a moment, I can commemorate privately my family and what happened to them in Europe. But as a citizen, insofar as practices of commemorations are concerned, they can be shared to citizens as such. And I bring Ahmad Tibi, one of the most well-known Palestinian Israeli members of Knesset. He gave an important speech in 2010 on Holocaust Memorial Day, an important speech speaking from the podium of the Knesset, commemorating the Holocaust.
Yes.
Speaking of the revival of Jewish people in Palestine as a triumph of Holocaust survivors who managed to save themselves. This is someone who's, for Israelis, usually well known as one of the harshest critics of Zionism, one of the biggest traitors, quote unquote, from the Arab side. So I try to show...
You have to explain that it was not in an ironic way.
Ironic way,
his speech to commemorate.
Oh, no, of course not. This could come as an irony. Of course not. Of course not. Ahmad Tibi spoke there as I call it, as a patriot. But if a patriot, then of a state that still has to be established. A state where he really lives with Jews equally. If the discourse of and the practices of Holocaust commemoration in Israel consist in excluding Palestinians because the most important principle of the state, the Holocaust, excludes them by definition, Ahmad Tibi actually showed that he can insert himself into this holy of holies and thereby question this assumption that it's either or. And I think on the first look it would seem that Ahmad Tibi and Yehuda Elkanah contradict each other. Yehuda Elkanah says the most important political task is to forget the Holocaust because it goes against democratic politics, the memory. Ahmad Tibi stands on the podium of the Knesset and gives a magnificent, really, commemoration of the Holocaust. I try to show no. What Ahmad Tibi does there is the best example of what it means to forget the Holocaust, to denationalize it, to forget this way, this perspective of memory, and to remember from a perspective, as Nietzsche would put it, to remember it from a perspective that's healthier for life.
And the Nakba?
Good. And the Nakba now, so I'll jump the gun and I'll give you my bottom line. I think that the exact same needs to happen with the Nakba. The Nakba too, to be provocative, has to be forgotten like the Holocaust, but of course not really forgotten. And in order to be forgotten like the Holocaust has to be forgotten, that is, in order to be remembered as a civic duty, the Nakba has to be remembered. Because you can only forget, you can only engage in this practice, this civic practice of forgetting what you remember. The Nakba currently is repressed, not known, buried. Most people in Israel pretend it never happened. There was no Nakba. People still debate it. They think it's open to debate whether the event occurred. In a place that I think the task is for a binational state. The task is to commemorate the Nakba, to research the Nakba, to teach the Nakba in schools, so that a national memory of the Nakba can be forgotten, and that Jews and Palestinians in Israel can remember the Nakba together, just like they can with the Holocaust. that demands a strong concept of citizenship. But I think that nothing less than that will enable the Haifa Republic. Look,
so that's
yeah.
now the transition to the next chapter of our discussion.
Good.
You already started. So what is this idea
the
about
idea
the Haifa Republic?
The idea is not to have a sharp distinction between the two-state solution or the one-state solution. They they're not necessarily standing, they're not contradictory. Federative constellations can exist between the two, so to speak, and they are the only way towards the future. However, a federative constellation cannot be cheap. And by not be cheap, I mean it would require, and I'm saying this to Swiss people who know this much better than I do, and this is something that I stand to be corrected and educated. I mean it in this form. It requires a strong sense of equality, a strong sense of binationalism. For example, the Begin plan that you mentioned, we can speak about its details later on. It was not a binational plan, that needs to be stated. Begin in 1977 was pressed by President Carter and Anwar Sadat to offer something to the Palestinians as part of the peace agreement with Egypt. Begin was an opponent of territorial compromise with the Palestinians. He offered instead the so-called autonomy plan. The autonomy plan was to say Israel annexes the whole territory, including Gaza and the West Bank. It gives an autonomy to the Palestinians, so they have self-determination. But it also offers them, and that's a part of the plan that's forgotten by everybody, interestingly enough, it also offers all Palestinians Israeli citizenship. So they can vote and get elected into Israel's parliament. They have full freedom of movement on the whole territory. They have full economic rights on the whole territory, and so forth and so forth. Now, this is interesting. The Israeli parliament, the Knesset, voted on it and passed it, 64 for it, 40 abstained, 8 against. Shocking for anyone who knows Israeli history, including to Israelis, who usually when I tell them that, they tell me that this cannot be true. And I understand why they do, because we form our beliefs not just by believing a certain fact, but it has to be consistent with the world as we know it. And this is inconsistent with the world as they know it. Yeah. But this is a true fact. Still, this plan, which is extremely interesting, extremely anomalous from the perspective of current taboos, is not really binational. Because it has a Jewish state, and within a Jewish state it has an autonomy.
Some cantons.
My idea, exactly. So my idea is to actually have a. I think that binationalism can only function, to say nothing about the fact that the Palestinians are a majority. So giving them minority rights it doesn't make sense. Can only function with genuine binationalism. That's a difficult part because it will be extremely difficult to construct. But for that reason, in order to enable it, you need the state of mind, you need the history, you need the legislation of genuine binationalism. And this is why I insist on a strong notion of joint citizenship for both of those people. This is why the Holocaust and the Nakba have to be remembered and forgotten together. That's the example. So the Haifa Republic, as I imagine it, is I try to construct it from the Begin plan, and the reason is that it's a way of showing. Zibila said, you said I was coming from the center of society or something like that.
Middle.
I don't know. I don't know if I don't know if I subscribe to that actually, but I think that I would put it in different terms. I would say what I try to break in the book, also with the Begin plan, is this Auseinandersetzung between the liberal Zionists on the one side and the anti-Zionists on the other. They all have this passionately held agreement about the axiom that in order to be a Zionist, you have to accept the idea of a Jewish state. That for that reason, if you're a Zionist, then only the two-state solution can work. I think this is just false. You can be a Zionist. To that extent, maybe I'm coming from the center of society, though I think that's probably not true. You can be genuinely committed to the main aspiration of Zionism, which are self-determination to the Jewish people, but without accepting the notion of a Jewish state.
You have said that in another way, like sovereignty.
There is a distinction that's often forgotten between sovereignty and self-determination.
Yes.
Sovereignty is a notion of a state, and self-determination is a notion of a canton or an autonomy that can even go very far. So depending on how we want to define it, we can say that the Jewish and the Palestinian states would not have sovereignty, but they would have self-determination. Or as I prefer to put it, they will be sub-sovereign, they will be almost sovereign, only that their sovereignty will be checked by a joint constitution.
Mit den gleichen Rechten, sagst du. Also auch zum Beispiel das viel umstrittene Rückkehrrecht. Du würdest es auf der palästinensischen wie auf der jüdischen Seite geben und Niederlassungsfreiheit. Also ein Palästinenser kann nach Jaffa zurückkommen oder nach Lud oder wo immer auch er herkommt. Und die Besiedler können in den Siedlungen bleiben. Das ist schon deine Vorstellung.
That's the direction. It does not have to be now concretely decided exactly how this will be unpacked, but I don't say this in order to avoid answering the difficult question of the right of return directly. So let me be clear. In my idea, full equality demands full equality in relation to the right of return. Since I make so much of the Nakba as necessary to Israeli citizenship, I do not think that there can be any other way of having this notion of citizenship without recognizing the right of return. I think that the right of return of Palestinians does not pose the same difficulties that people often think that it does. I think that it has become, sometimes for both sides, an excuse to derail the conversation. There are ways of recognizing the right of return of Palestinians in meaningful ways, in extremely meaningful ways, without do you know, I don't know how many people here have watched, Star Trek. Star Trek, you have Geordi. Yeah. He's the technician who, you say, beam me up, Geordi, and you press something and people just... I don't think that recognizing the right of return will be akin to that type of maneuver where suddenly 5 million Palestinians will emerge between Haifa and Tel Aviv. That's not how it functions. This is not how it has to be recognized.
Na gut, aber 1 Million Russen sind auch gekommen. Man kann da nicht sicher sein.
A million Russian newcomers came. That's a lot.
Und das haben auch gesagt, ja, man hat das Recht, aber wer will schon, oder? Und dann kam 1 Million.
No, I think that
geschichtlichen Umstände können ändern.
I think that there has to be serious consideration of the number of Palestinians who can come back. By the way, the Begin plan contained such a solution, and I think that as a beginning, it's a wonderful place to begin. So this is we're going back to the notion of compromise, rotten and good. I think there will have to be a good compromise there, and I think that where there's genuine willingness to recognize a right of return, what can work in practice can be negotiated. The Begin plan contained a clause that stated extremely clearly that there is a right of return and that there will be a joint committee of Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and Jordan to decide the numbers. They were speaking in the, for a moment I can't remember if the 10,000 or hundreds of thousands. I think the numbers can be higher, probably. By the way, I am not a big supporter of the right of return of Jews to the State of Israel. I don't know if this surprises anybody. I do not think that any Jew worldwide should have the right to become automatically a citizen of the Jewish state. I think, again, I don't know if this surprises anybody. I think that by means of recognizing the Palestinian right of return, there will be much more pressure to recognize the return of Palestinians in large numbers, while actually checking the automatic naturalization of Jews. I think that at the same time, states that will have the sensitivity to the history also of the Jews can also have in this constitution a clause that specifies very clearly its commitment to accepting Jews if they're persecuted, for example. So the point is the following. The problems are deep and severe, but I think that they can be negotiated and compromised upon if there is a genuine commitment to a genuine compromise in the good sense of the term. Justice will not happen. Look, I don't know how many people here think that the Germans have done justice to their past. They haven't. I think that's clear. But that is not what was supposed to happen. The Germans went a long way to compromise in a way about their past and move on from it. Justice will not be done to the history of the Nakba. But the right compromise moving forward to improve peace for Jews and Palestinians in Palestine, going not through a rotten compromise, but a genuine compromise, I believe can be achieved.
Was sagt die palästinensische Seite zu deinen Vor... Hast du Reaktionen? Weil es braucht ja zwei für einen Tango, bekanntlich.
Yeah.
I have not spoken deeply about that with many Palestinians. I would be delighted to have a Palestinian respond to that. But I do have some experience discussing this with some Palestinians. This is not, I did not do a research. This is not speaking, this is not a sociological research. This is not, I didn't speak with leaders or representatives. But I'll say this, take it with a grain of salt. I want to be fair and not pretend that I know something where I don't. My feeling is when I speak to Palestinians about this, there is an obvious realization that something like this can be done. When I speak to my leftist friends in New York, they're getting angry because they insist on the justice and because coming with a certain anti-Zionist baggage, they want to press the Nakba and the right of return in order to prevent any compromise, not even the ones that can move forward. There will not be, you cannot do justice to the past. Nietzsche got that right. There will not be, justice will not be done to the past. But,
Okay.
but moving forward can be achieved by taking the past seriously.
Okay, that's
Very nice.
kind of
Yeah.
ending, let's say, of this closed circuit here. I noticed that there are a lot of people want to ask you some questions. We are already over time. Is there a microphone? Yeah, there is. Maybe Tommy, you can help her. There. I mean, the question was in the first place, what is about the Haifa Republic? But maybe you can answer first shortly about your hope into the Haifa Republic, which may lead to some questions from the public.
So I speak first.
Yeah, in the just
Haifa, I hope I understand the question and I can then do this in a concise way. The Haifa Republic, the reason I call this the Haifa Republic is the following. People in Israel, and not just in Israel, like to speak about the two models for the future. The Jerusalem model and the Tel Aviv model. Jerusalem is a city of longing of all the religions. Tel Aviv, but also a house of fanatics, obviously. Tel Aviv is the model of what a cool Jewish beach party can look like if Jews only got to live among themselves, liberal Jews got to live among themselves in the Middle East. Tel Aviv is a model of the Jewish and democratic state, but only with Jews. And I think both models are false, and this and whether order for that reason has to be overcome. Haifa is a less known city, usually not celebrated as Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, for understandable reasons. However, it has a model of joint living together, unlike Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. Now, significantly, this has to be mentioned, because sometimes, as people accuse me sometimes of being a Begin romantic, they also accuse me of thinking that Haifa is a utopia, and Haifa is not a utopia. I was just there. It's not an easy, shiny city, hardly. The point is to say it proves that there is another model, that where Arabs and Jews live together, even though in the current context there is no justice and the conditions are extremely difficult, Jews and Palestinians, where there are where the city itself demands it, can actually live together. So Haifa has to be looked upon as the model of cohabitation rather than Tel Aviv, probably Tel Aviv, because no liberal Zionist looks to Jerusalem anymore in order to pretend that that's the future. That's the idea of the Haifa Republic.
Okay, so we don't go now in specifics because we want to have some question, a lot of questions, I see. Yes, we hear you well. Just speak in the... Nur mal einfach dieses Mikrofon reden. Einfach dieses Mikrofon reden. Dann hört man das gut.
Okay. Yeah, I have an intriguing question. It's great what you told. Your plan is great, absolutely great. But how can it be done with two people? At the moment, the two peoples, the Palestinians and the Jews, are hating each other. They are fearing each other. And unfortunately, history tells us that such a hate and such a situation only goes away, usually, unfortunately, after a lot of bloodshed. I always was intrigued by the question why in Europe, why the first World War, wasn't enough. 15 million deaths. That wasn't not enough.
So what was
they
the
had
question?
to wait for the 60 million plus Holocaust, the Shoah, for the Second World War. So how, and then finally Europe awoke and started the project, the European project, and now we have peace.
So the question is how many millions should...
How we get this your plan, or any plan, into the brains of the people there without such a first bloodshed?
The short answer is I don't know. However, I think we've had...
You have written in your book. You have written.
Then remind me.
Wenn ihr wollt, ist es kein Märchen.
Ja, wenn ihr wollt, ist es kein Märchen.
It's Taylor Herzl. I mean, sorry. He started up a plan and nobody was believing him. So that's I think that's the answer.
That still is a short answer. I agree about that. It's a short answer, but it's a very meaningful one. This is why, for me at least, it's the motto of the book. It means it seems far-fetched. We have no other alternative. This is what we need to have to achieve. Whether we're going to achieve it or not, I do not know. It's possible that there's going to be more bloodshed. If you ask me what's my estimation is that there's going to be a lot of more bloodshed and not the Haifa Republic, unfortunately. But again, speaking as a philosopher, call it, I speak about what ought to be. The question is, what are the problems standing on the way and how we can try to overcome them. The hate that you spoke about exists, but I suggest also not using it as an ideology in order to prevent all optimisms that can take us forward. For example, in Haifa, for example, in the Galilee, but in other places within Israel, not to pretend that there is equality or justice or that things are simple. That's the other risk. Jews and Palestinians can also live together and can also be friends. And despite the animosity, there are also practices that go against that. I suggest focusing on them, not just to promote positive thinking, but to treat those moments as anchors that can be held in order to develop them into broader anchors of trust. One example that did not make it into this book, but will make it into the English edition. This happened after the book, after the book was in the printers, is the rise of the joint list in Israel. The Arab joint list in Israel is a common list of Arab parties that has a tremendous success, relative, but still impressive success among Jewish voters. Look at my father. My father is a 70-something son of a Holocaust survivors, a reserve officer in the IDF, a liberal Zionist his whole life. He voted twice already for the joint list. So he looks at, I vote for them, but that doesn't surprise anybody coming from where I come from in Israeli society. My father, a lifelong Meretz voter, felt in the last year that he's best represented by an Arab list. He's not the only one. His cousin, who's 10 years older than he, and also similar history, similar biography, also voted for the joint list. There was, the joint list more than doubled its voters among Jewish voters within a few months. This is complicated. I'll keep it short, so I will not explain all. I will not give you now all the footnotes. That's an example of what? A proof that it's going to be easy? No. But of the type of moments we have to hold on to, develop them to build more trust in order to construct this type of politics. I answered Zebile earlier on. I said the Palestinian people is united. This means that this joint list can be also seen as leaders of the Palestinian people also in the West Bank. The idea that they're not is still hostage to the two-state solution type of thinking.
But maybe, I can add, because the question of Sibyl was, what is about the Palestinian? We know all that there is one Palestinian leader in prison since 20 years. His name is Mahmoud Barghouti, and his program is a binational state. And why is he in prison? We know why, because Abbas
that's his program.
That's his program. That's why he is there. So I mean, I believe it. I mean, we have seen so many things happen in our life. You know, we are elderly people. You know, we never expected that the Soviet Union could fall or whatever. You know, or that China become capitalist. Whatever. I'm joking. But I believe it would be also possible on that way. Now, of course, they will not love each other, you know, the next day. I mean, especially in Switzerland, you know, Swiss people, if you would ask them how many friends they have on the French part or or vice versa, they would say, I don't like them, you know. So, generally, I notice this exists also here. So, well, but it works. It works.
Yeah.
Thank you. So next question.
Okay, I think it's probably easier that you find some Palestinians that go together with Israelis. I don't know how you call them, or maybe you call them colonists to refuse. But the problem is you have in the Palestinian society, you know, if a female DJ gets arrested because she's a female DJ, in the Jewish part of Israel, you have so many extreme differences then how can you bring that together without it falling apart first? I think it has to fall apart and then it can come together. Otherwise, if you look at the Islamists in this joint list, there are Islamists there, they're prepared to work together with the very extreme right because it's coming to women. They have the same thinking. So you might have a state. That's what I'm wondering what you're saying about it. Where you have, you have the extreme religious far right, and you probably have the LGBT on the left side, and Arab, Israeli, Jews, Palestinians, whatever you call them, they're mixed. The other ones are apart.
I think that's. I think I understand the worry. I think that the way you described it concretely, I would slightly shuffle the cards there, but I understand the challenge regardless. The Islamist party is no longer part of the joint list. It used to be, and then it left precisely because it wanted to go also with Benjamin Netanyahu and so forth. It's something that the joint list would not do. By the way, for the record, Samir is angry with me for speaking too long, but I will say I'm not a fan of the joint list supporting the alternative to Netanyahu either. I think that's a mistake, but I would put it as a footnote. There's a real issue. There's a real problem there. However, look at this Islamist party. The Islamist party, we say Islamist, I do not know you, sir, or the crowd, but sometimes when people speak about Islamists, people already hear terrorists or potential supporters. I'm not, God forbid, making such assumptions about you, I do not know. But this religious party, we have a lot of religious parties in Israel. This religious party is less extremist than our religious parties by far. Also when it comes to women, for example, when the Islamic party, this Islamic party was part of the joint list still, they entered a woman parliament member, a female parliament member, made it into the Knesset as a representative of this Islamic party, something that by no means can happen to any of the religious parties, religious Jewish parties in Israel's parliament. So we need to shuffle the cards a little bit, not to say that I support religion. I'm not a religious person, and I do not accept the position of that party on anything. They do not speak the language of the extreme right in Israel. I wouldn't say that. They're just the contrary. They're willing to negotiate everything, including even their national rights. And for that reason, they're willing even to go with extreme right parties. By the way, that's the reason why I oppose the joint list supporting Naftali Bennett as the Prime Minister of Israel. Because people forget Naftali Bennett is, by any standard, extreme right. Avigdor Lieberman is someone who supports the expulsion of Palestinians. Yeah. The idea that the joint list would support them from the outside, to me, is verwerflich. I think that that's not a good compromise. It's an example of a bad compromise. I think that I did not answer your question completely, just the first part of it. Sorry, I know what the other part of the answer
Question.
Of the answered list.
That's okay. I just
No, let him answer now. It's okay now.
I think that the fact that the joint list lost some power, the list of the Arab parties lost some power, is potentially not such a bad thing, because if they were wise, which I'm afraid that they're not wise enough in my view, they would have run now together with Jews. It was clear in a year ago that they're doing marvelously among Jews suddenly, and that what needs to now happen is that they need to actually have Jewish representatives and become a real joint list, not an Arab fringe with some Jewish supporters. If they would become that, their position also on gay rights will change. For example, it could have become a genuine party or a bridge to a genuine party that supports democracy. This is not yet happening. I agree that this is far-fetched that it will, but we can imagine it, and we can hope that it will emerge.
Yes. Jochi, you have a question? Just a second, yes.
Ja, kann ich das Deutsch machen?
Ja,
Natürlich.
natürlich.
Ja.
Ich erinnere eine Bemerkung und eine Frage zum Right of Return. Ich erinnere mich, als sie das gesagt hat, an eine Arbeit von Yoav Pellet und N. Ruanna, einem jüdischen Israeli und einem palästinensischen Israeli. Und wir waren in einer Gruppe 2004 von Palästinenserinnen und Jüdinnen und Juden hier. Und da haben wir die Arbeit diskutiert. Er stellt ja im Zusammenhang mit dem Recht auf Return, stellt er ja die transitionale Gerechtigkeit. Das heißt, wenn ich das richtig verstanden habe, dass es ein Prozess ist für beide Seiten, der schließlich in der Anerkennung des vollen Rechts, also ich sage nichts über die Implementierung, sondern über das Recht auf Rückkehr. Ich gehe davon aus, dass Sie diese transitionale Justice kennen und ich wollte Sie einfach fragen, was Sie davon halten.
I'm not completely sure that I understand the concept. So when you speak about transitional justice, if I understand the concept correctly, then it's very similar to the position that I was trying to sketch, namely to say the Palestinians have the right of return. They have it because rights are not just subjective inventions. I don't know if they exist in a Platonic heaven, they probably don't, but they are objective. And if I believe that there is such a thing as national rights at all, sometimes, let's say, if I accept the as an axiom or as a language game, the claim that there are national rights, then the Palestinians have the right of return. That's first step. Recognizing it is already a second, and there can be extremely meaningful ways to recognizing it, again, without just having, 5 million Palestinians popping up at the center of Israel. But there can be methods and practices to not just recognize it in an empty way, which would not imply a recognition, but to recognize it in a deeply political way. Some of it is, for example, giving compensation. Compensating people for land is also a form of concretely recognizing a certain evil, a certain crime, and it can be coupled with also having some people return. If that is similar to the idea that the transitional justice type of framework, then
In diesem Modell von Yoav Pellet und von Ruanna ist eigentlich das Prozesshafte des Anerkennung des existierenden Rechts, da habe ich kein Problem. Aber es muss ja auch noch anerkannt werden von jüdischen Israeli, Frauen und Männer. Das wollte ich eigentlich sagen, das Prozesshafte, damit es einen guten Kompromiss gibt.
Aber das meinte vorhin
der
Omri meinte das auch so. Ja.
Absolutely, I think this is one of the things this is why this chapter on the Nakba exists. It says we have to begin by knowing what happened. We have to begin by taking responsibility to it. I'm a fan of legislating a Nakba law. Right now, Israel has a Nakba law. The Nakba law says that in some circumstances you cannot commemorate the Nakba. I think that we have to have a Nakba law that says that we have to commemorate the Nakba. When Meretz, some time ago, started to want to do politics with Arab parties. Each suggested a law that to commemorate the Kfar Qasim massacre, for those of you who know it. I deeply oppose it because it's hypocrisy. The Kfar Qasim massacre is presented as an Ausnahme, or as something that is unique and that we commemorate by means of showing that when we do have such a crime in our history, we by all means commemorate it. It is really high time for a party like Meretz to move away from this lie and to have a commemoration of the Nakba, not some lip service to some Arabs to say, ah, yeah, we'll throw you a bone here, we'll commemorate Kfar Qasim, and now we'll do politics together. There has to be a certain seriousness on the side of Israeli Jews to taking the history of their compatriots, Palestinians, as essential to the state.
Gut, das war ein interessantes Statement. Könnte man fast als letztes durchgehen lassen, weil wir haben ja schon 9:30. Also wir sind schon viel länger. Ich weiß, dass es Ihnen nicht so gegangen ist.
Es hat, glaube ich, dort noch eine ganz
Ja,
dringende
dort hinten
Frage.
auch. Also wir lassen noch 2 Fragen zu. Ja, ist das okay? Dort hinten hat es eine und dann noch diese hier. Ja?
So how is it possible that in 1977, when the state was threatened in its very existence, that they put forward such a compromise with the Begin plan, but nowadays the state is so powerful, the state of Israel, and doesn't really have any threat to its existence, that people in the parliament are not as willing to compromise anymore? Like how did it change so extremely from one side to the other one?
Maybe just, so first, I do not know the answer to that question. I take it it's a fact, but whether, how we understand it and how we understand this transition, I'm not sure. But notice something that you said that's interesting. I think that maybe, despite the commonsensical thought that when the state is threatened, it cannot compromise. And when it's so powerful, why doesn't it? I think there's actually a fallacy there. The state compromised because it had to. The state depended, for example, on a peace with Egypt. Don't forget, the situation with Egypt doesn't matter that Israel was stronger than Egypt and could win wars against Egypt into the future. The Yom Kippur War proved that this is not so simple. The state was threatened and had to have peace with Egypt, and that peace was important because the Yom Kippur War proved that how important it is, and it was important because for a moment with President Carter, it became clear that the Americans are putting their weight. So the state had to compromise. I think that's a good example. You know, Sadat, in a way, threw the Palestinians under the bus. That has to be said. When he agreed to have peace with Israel, in the end, without implementing any solution to the Palestinians, because something was offered, but in the end was not implemented, you've noticed, I'm sure. This meant that precisely because the state of Israel is no longer threatened, it's not, it doesn't have to compromise with the Palestinians. There is no power in the region that makes compromise necessary. That's the reason I take it why Israel does not really compromise, because it doesn't have to. And that is might be one of the main obstacles to the Haifa Republic. You're expecting a state to, in a way, give up its sovereignty. What's the power making it do that thing? Why should a state diminish its sovereignty without having a real reason to do that? Now, there is a real reason to do that, but people don't see that. The reason is that the state is threatened, but it's very easy to pretend that it isn't. It's very easy to feel that it's not.
Good. So we come to the last question now.
Actually, I don't know where to start because you have a very interesting background from being military, personal, to a philosopher. But you mentioned a few things that makes me believe that you still have thoughts between being an ex-Israeli soldier and a philosopher. Like when you talk about compromise, the Palestinians never had the chance to compromise. Everything was imposed on them with compulsion, you know? And the two-state solution, I agree with you. The two-state solution was a great idea for the right-wing Zionists to trap the Palestinians there and keep controlling them. And you confirm that by this peace treaty with Egypt, when Menachem Begin had an idea of autonomy, but not a Palestinian state, which was an old idea of not giving an inch of land to the Palestinians to rule. Okay. So here, talking about compromise, no, we're talking about actually forcing things on the Palestinians. My point is, the problem with the state of Israel, that it's dealing with the Palestinian with the upper hand. They don't treat the Palestinians as equal, you know, like what happened in South Africa. You know, when they brought the ANC, you know, with Nelson Mandela and the whole group, and created a great state, and wrote the most sophisticated constitution in modern time. So here we go. Israel never dealt with the Palestinian as an equal partner in the peace process. They kept confiscating land. The discriminatory wall confiscated over 83,000 acres of land from the Palestinians. So I think this is one of the biggest problems. And it's a question too that, don't you think that this will lead to a disastrous future for the state of Israel? And now even the human rights organization B'Tselem, I think it's called in Israel, consider the Israeli regime as an apartheid regime. And this was confirmed by the international
Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch, that it is an apartheid. So my point is, and I don't want to be long here, I think the Holocaust thing, what you mentioned, it makes sense to me that you denationalize it, you call it this way. But I think that what happened in the Holocaust was a heinous act against European Jews, homosexuals, gypsies who were killed, you know, murdered brutally. I mean, a Nakba is still something easier, where the Palestinians fled to refugee camps. They still have the right or the chance to resist and fight for their rights. So again, about the right, you know, another thing that Israel keeps dealing with the Palestinians, that they talk to the Palestinians as if they are giving them a gift. You know, they are not talking to the Palestinian saying, we're returning your rights. This is a legitimate political human right that was taken in 1948 from them. So as far as you deal with the other person as the underdog, as the black sheep, as the little, you know, child, that I will give you this gift, there will not be any peace. And then in the end of the day, they picked up their puppet like Abbas and you know, serving their interests. The whole Oslo agreement was a communication about security. Now, I want to finish here because I don't want to take more time. But my question to you, sir, you said liberal Zionists and right-wing Zionists. I mean, how does that look like? Like, you know, what made Israel polarize so far to the right, okay, since the assassination of Rabin, which declared the right-wing policies in Israel dead, okay? Is it because of the local factors inside the state of Israel, or is it because of the international influence that the world is keening more toward the right? And I'm sorry about lengthening. Thank you.
Wow,
Don't be
that
sorry.
gives a long answer. I
Yeah,
guess.
no, I'll have to take another hour of your time. And I tried to write fast notes to see that I can manage to answer everything fast. And do me a favor, and if I miss something important, do remind me to the anger of Samir to my right. Our main disagreement are about two things that you said right at the beginning. That I'm a philosopher and that I'm a soldier. I'm neither. I was a soldier like any other Israeli who was drafted. My position now on paper, I can send you the published articles, is that it's better for Israelis to go to prison than to serve in the military. I don't consider myself as someone with a militarist past. It was just, I was doing my duty, and if you ask me now, I would educate my son to do his duty and not to serve. Philosopher, it's not for me to decide. I'm a professor of philosophy, but I don't consider myself necessarily a philosopher. The rest of the things that you said, I think that we basically agreed on everything. I'm on paper calling Israel not an apartheid state, but a state that has apartheid practices without question. The situation in the West Bank is apartheid. The situation within Israel is first cannot be distinguished from the West Bank. And even Arab Israelis or Palestinian Israelis who are citizens are at best second-class citizens. And for that reason, the apartheid language is not something that I think it's a truth. As to the relation between that proposition and the way in which we go about negotiating with the Palestinians. The whole idea here, look, I can only speak as an Israeli Jew, and as an Israeli Jew, attempt to do justice to my own history as a perpetrator, not just as a grandson of survivors. And as someone whose people are responsible to the Nakba, among other things, and to the occupation, to the Nakba and the occupation. That does it, because that doesn't just leave us in the occupation type of language. If you read the book, you will see that the book opens with an explanation and answers that I think you will agree with to the question of what made Zionists go to the extreme right. The answer is, in the book, that Zionism consists in ethnic politics. And this ethnic politics is inconsistent with liberalism, and that because Israeli Jews were indoctrinated to be Zionists, whenever they had to choose between liberalism and ethnic politics, they chose ethnic politics. That's the reason why we've gone so far to the right. Pass off. I would absolutely agree, you did not say that, but I will just throw that in, that even the best liberal Zionists, Aaron Barak, the judge, Amos Oz, sometimes David Grossman, sometimes the position that they choose as liberal Zionists would make them in Germany, would put them in the right. I don't want to say how far right. They go under attack in the book for that reason. Those things need to be said as clearly so that when we come to imagine a state that's genuinely binational and not the Jews imposing on the Palestinians anything from above, we will have at least a chance of doing that. I agree about the issue of compromise. All compromises were imposed on Palestinians. I mentioned in brief the 47 UN resolution. I think it was a rotten compromise. I think that offering 1,200,000 Palestinians to share the land with 600,000 Jews, half-half, is a rotten compromise. and that we're still learning now that the Jews accepted and the Palestinians didn't, and for that reason they were kicked out. That's a victor's history, if there ever was any, and that's stated clearly in the book. So I don't think that we disagree as much as you seem to think that.
Okay, I'm happy on that. The rest of you can buy the book, which is there on a stand. Maybe you can even have a signature of Omri if you're nice with him. And it's a lot of interesting stuff in it, so please buy it. And tell your friends that they missed something really interesting and they have the chance to see it on Cosmos Virtual. So they can watch it on YouTube. And by the way, next Monday we are again here with 3 young feminists, because the evening will be on the theme Frauen schlägt. Okay, so I hope to see you then. Maybe a little bit shorter, but this has to do because these are very young women, fighter women, feminists, and they will make it very short, that's for sure. Thank you very much, Omri.
Thank you.
To come such a long way, so you had also a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sibyl.
Thank you.
Thank you.